What if the person you look down on today holds the key to your success tomorrow? This is the story of a man who had it all: money, power, and influence. And yet, he lacked the one thing that truly mattered: humility. Meet Richard Thompson, a billionaire entrepreneur, admired by many, feared by some. He owned one of the most successful companies in the city. But beneath the wealth and success was a man blinded by arrogance. And then, there was Mr. Jenkins, the janitor. Quiet, reserved, and seemingly ordinary. Every day, he cleaned the very floors that Richard walked on, without expecting so much as a thank you. But what Richard didn't know, was that this janitor was no ordinary man. And soon, fate would teach him a lesson he would never forget. Richard Thompson had everything: money, power, and the belief that he was superior to everyone around him. He didn't just ignore the people beneath him, he mocked them. "I don't care how hard they work. If they can't afford a decent suit, they don't belong in my presence." Richard Thompson had built his empire from the ground up, or so he liked to tell people. A self-made billionaire, a ruthless businessman, a man who commanded respect wherever he went. Or, at least, that's what he believed. And then, there was the janitor. Mr. Jenkins had been there for years, moving through the office like a shadow. Quiet, invisible, irrelevant. At least, that's how Richard saw him. To a man like Richard, success was measured by wealth and power. And anyone who lacked those things, well, they were beneath him. So when he saw the janitor, working late, moving slowly as if he had all the time in the world, he scoffed. Richard Thompson didn't just ignore the janitor, he pitied him. In his mind, a man who spent his days sweeping floors had no ambition, no drive, no real purpose. After all, what kind of man chooses a life like that? Richard believed he was at the top of the world. Untouchable. Powerful. But power has a way of slipping through the fingers of those who hold it too tightly. And soon, Richard Thompson would learn that the man he mocked was far greater than he could ever imagine. Every night, while Richard Thompson buried himself in work, the janitor moved silently through the office, sweeping, dusting, wiping down desks that had been left in chaos. Most people barely noticed him. To Richard, he was just another faceless worker, someone beneath his concern. Richard had no patience for interruptions, and he saw the janitor's quiet presence as exactly that, an interruption. He often rolled his eyes when he heard the soft swish of the broom outside his office, annoyed by the sound. He had never spoken a word to the man, except to tell him to be quieter. But Mr. Jenkins was not like other janitors. He moved with purpose, his gaze steady, his expression calm. He never rushed, never complained, and never looked bitter about the work he had to do. There was something different about him, something, knowing. At first, Richard dismissed the feeling. But as the weeks went on, he found himself strangely aware of the janitor's presence. It wasn't just the way he worked, it was the way he carried himself. There was no desperation in his movements, no frustration in his eyes. Unlike Richard, he never seemed burdened by anything. Richard was surrounded by executives in expensive suits, people who spoke with confidence and authority. And yet, none of them had the quiet certainty that this old janitor seemed to carry. It was as if he knew something the rest of the world did not. Richard never thought to ask who the janitor really was. After all, why would a man like him waste time thinking about a janitor? For weeks, Richard had ignored the strange presence of the janitor, dismissing him as nothing more than a lowly worker. But life has a way of humbling those who think they are untouchable. And for Richard, that moment was about to come. It started with a phone call. A deal that was supposed to secure his company's dominance had fallen through. Millions of dollars were slipping from his grasp. Investors were pulling out. There were whispers of scandal, of financial mismanagement. Richard assured himself it was temporary. But the cracks were forming. Then came the lawsuit. A competitor had accused him of unethical practices. The media caught on, and soon, Richard's name was splashed across every news outlet, not as a visionary leader, but as a man whose empire was crumbling. The board of directors held emergency meetings without him. Investors who once fought for his attention now refused to take his calls. And one by one, his so-called allies disappeared, leaving him alone to face the chaos. Richard had spent his entire career building an empire, convinced that wealth and status made him invincible. But as everything unraveled, he realized something terrifying: he had built his kingdom on sand. And now, the tide was coming in. Through it all, the janitor remained. While Richard's world collapsed, the old man continued his work, steady and unbothered. And for the first time, Richard truly noticed him. A slow, lingering shot of Richard watching Mr. Jenkins, his gaze no longer filled with arrogance, but with something else. Something like curiosity. The man he had mocked, ignored, and dismissed, was still standing. Unshaken. And for reasons Richard couldn't yet understand, that unsettled him more than anything. Richard Thompson had spent years believing that power came from wealth, status, and control. But in just a few weeks, everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. His empire was in ruins, his reputation tarnished. And yet, there was one man who remained unchanged. The janitor, Mr. Jenkins, had always been there, unnoticed, unbothered by the chaos around him. But as Richard sat in his office, lost in his thoughts, a question formed in his mind. Who was this man, really? For the first time, Richard truly looked at him. He wasn't just some old man pushing a broom. There was something different about him, something Richard had never bothered to see. What Richard didn't know, what no one in that office had ever bothered to ask, was that Mr. Jenkins wasn't just a janitor. Decades ago, he had been something else entirely. A leader. A businessman. A man who had once stood exactly where Richard stood now. At the height of his career, Mr. Jenkins had made a choice. He had seen what power did to men, how it consumed them, how it made them believe they were untouchable. And so, one day, he walked away. He left behind the wealth, the status, the endless chase for more. And in doing so, he had found something Richard never had: peace. Richard had spent his life believing that success was measured in money and power. But sitting there, watching a janitor who had once been more powerful than he ever was, he realized how wrong he had been. For the first time in his life, Richard Thompson questioned everything he had believed. He had spent years chasing power, wealth, and status, believing they were the ultimate measures of success. Yet, here stood a man who had walked away from it all, and somehow, he seemed richer than Richard had ever felt. Richard had built an empire, yet he was alone, drowning in problems he couldn't solve. Meanwhile, the janitor, this man who had once been as powerful as him, lived simply, with no burden weighing him down. Richard had wealth, but Jenkins had something far more valuable: peace. It wasn't just about money. It was about how a man chose to live. Richard had spent his life controlling, dominating, taking. Jenkins had chosen to let go. And in doing so, he had gained something Richard never could: freedom from the chains of greed. Richard had spent his life believing he was above everyone else. But now, for the first time, he saw himself clearly. He wasn't the master of the world, he was just another man, trapped by his own ambition. And the one he had mocked? He had been free all along. That night, Richard Thompson didn't leave the office feeling powerful. He didn't feel wealthy. He felt something he had never felt before: small. And for the first time in his life, he understood that being small wasn't a weakness. It was a lesson. For years, Richard Thompson believed he was untouchable. That wealth made him superior. That power meant control. But in the end, he had been blind. And it took a man he once mocked to open his eyes. That night, Richard didn't leave his office with the same arrogance he once carried. Instead, he walked out with something far greater than wealth: understanding. He had spent his life building walls, climbing ladders, chasing an illusion of success. But true success was never about money. He finally saw the truth: money could buy influence, but not respect. It could buy attention, but not loyalty. It could buy luxury, but not peace. Richard never looked at the janitor the same way again. He never mocked him. Never ignored him. Instead, he observed, he listened, and for the first time, he learned. He learned that power wasn't in the title you held, but in the wisdom you carried. That wealth wasn't in the numbers in your bank account, but in the peace you found within yourself. And that true success was knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The rich man had mocked the janitor. But in the end, it was the janitor who had the last lesson to teach. And Richard Thompson? He would never forget it. Lessons to learn from this story. First lesson. True wealth isn't about money, it's about peace. Richard had everything money could buy, but he was never at peace. He was constantly chasing more, terrified of losing what he had. Meanwhile, Jenkins, who had walked away from wealth, lived a life free from that burden. The story reminds us that success is not about material possessions but about inner fulfillment. Second lesson. Power is an illusion, it can disappear overnight. Richard believed he was untouchable, but his downfall came faster than he expected. Many people tie their self-worth to their position in society, but the truth is, power is fragile. If your identity is built solely on external success, what happens when it's taken away? Third lesson. Never underestimate anyone. Richard mocked Jenkins because he judged him based on his appearance and job. But he failed to ask the most important question: who is this man, really? If he had been paying attention, he might have learned from Jenkins earlier. This teaches us that wisdom and greatness can come from unexpected places. Never judge a person by their title alone. Fourth lesson. Humility is more powerful than arrogance. Richard's arrogance made him blind to the truth, while Jenkins' humility allowed him to see life clearly. In the end, the one who was mocked became the teacher, and the one who mocked had to learn. True strength lies not in showing superiority but in understanding life beyond status and wealth. Fifth lesson. The greatest lessons in life often come from the least expected places. Jenkins never spoke much, but his presence and choices taught Richard the most valuable lesson of his life. Sometimes, wisdom isn't found in boardrooms or business schools, it's found in quiet moments, in the lives of people we often overlook. Final thought, who are you in this story? Are you Richard, chasing success without ever feeling satisfied, looking down on those who don't seem to have it all? Or are you Jenkins, someone who understands that life is more than just power and money, and that true success is about peace and fulfillment? This story isn't just about a rich man and a janitor, it's about all of us. It's a reminder to reflect on what truly matters in life. Because in the end, the wealthiest man isn't the one who has the most, but the one who needs the least.
End of story.
Please, subscribe for more.
Click the button.